The first thing I remember is the smell of antiseptic. Cold, sterile, endless antiseptic. Hospitals have a way of making you feel invisible, like the world is moving outside and you are frozen in place. I could hear the faint hum of machines and the distant conversations of nurses, but it felt like I was underwater, trapped, alone, and waiting for someone to notice me. That's when I realized the people I had spent my life caring for, the ones I had nurtured, protected, and loved unconditionally, might have already forgotten I existed. I never imagined that my own children could betray me in ways I had only seen in the news. But when I opened my eyes that first night after surgery, staring at the pale walls of the hospital room, a phone call shattered my fragile peace. "Mom?" "We sold the house," the voice on the other end said casually, almost laughing. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. My children had made a choice, without asking me, without even consulting me, while I was lying helpless, trusting them to keep my home safe. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened. My heart pounded like it would explode. I wanted to scream, to run, to shake them until they remembered the person who had given them everything. But I couldn't. I was weak, bound by illness. My body refused to obey me, and yet the betrayal seared into my mind. Every memory of raising them flashed like a harsh light. Sleepless nights, school lunches, arguments over chores, birthdays celebrated, sacrifices made. Everything I had done, reduced to a transaction in their eyes. I remember lying there, staring at the ceiling tiles, asking myself over and over, how could my own children do this to me? How could they turn on the one person who gave them life, who trusted them completely? That night, I didn't sleep. Not really. I listened to the machines beep in rhythm with my racing thoughts. I thought of the house I had built with my own hands, the garden I had nurtured, the walls that held my memories. And I thought of my children, laughing or scheming or making deals, while I lay unconscious, unaware of what they were planning. Hospital days are strange. Time moves differently when you are in pain and under observation. Minutes feel like hours. Hours feel like days. And in that distorted sense of reality, I had nothing to anchor me except memories of my family. The nurses were kind, professional, but I could see in their eyes that they thought my tears were about illness. They didn't know the real reason. They didn't know that I was grieving a life I thought was mine, slowly being taken from me by the very people I had trusted most. I couldn't sleep, so I wrote. In my mind, I wrote letters I would never send. I whispered to myself, "This cannot be happening. This cannot be real. My children love me. They would never." But reality has a cruel way of interrupting even the strongest hope. It was the third day in the hospital when my phone rang again. "Mom, the paperwork is done. The sale is finalized," my son said. His voice was calm, almost proud. I felt my stomach drop. My mind refused to process it. I whispered, barely audible, "What do you mean? The sale is done?" My daughter spoke next, almost as if rehearsed. "We did what had to be done. You're sick, and you needed help paying bills anyway. Don't worry about it." Help? Paying bills? That's what they called betrayal. That's what they called taking away a lifetime of memories, security, and love. I remember gripping the side of the hospital bed so hard my knuckles turned white. I could feel the weakness in my arms, but the rage inside me burned hotter than I had ever felt before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I didn't cry, not yet. Crying felt like admitting defeat. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, trying to piece together how my children could justify such a betrayal. I thought about their childhoods. I remembered the scraped knees I had kissed better, the nights I had stayed awake listening for nightmares, the lunches I packed, the lessons I taught. And yet, in a matter of hours while I was in a hospital bed, all of that seemed erased. It wasn't just a house they had taken. It was my sense of safety, my sense of belonging. My home, the place where I had felt most alive, was gone, and with it, a part of me that I didn't know how to reclaim. The house had been more than bricks and walls. It had been my sanctuary. I could see it in my mind, the sun streaming through the living room windows, the smell of fresh paint in the kitchen, the garden I spent countless mornings planting flowers in, and the walls lined with photographs of birthdays, graduations, and family holidays. Each corner held a memory. Each room had a story. And now all of that had been sold like a commodity, treated as though it were nothing more than paper and nails. I remembered walking through the rooms with my children when they were little. I had shown them every detail, every memory. And now, I realized they had walked those same rooms, planning to hand it over to strangers while I lay in the hospital, helpless. Anger warred with disbelief. Pain battled with love. I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to call the authorities. I wanted to storm into the real estate office and demand my home back. But part of me, the part that was weak from illness, knew that I couldn't. I had to recover. I had to regain strength before confronting them. So I lay there, trapped inside my body, thinking about the person I had raised my children to be, and wondering if I had failed somehow. Had I given them too much freedom? Had I been too trusting, too lenient? Had I somehow taught them that it was acceptable to betray the person who loved them most? The questions circled endlessly, each one more painful than the last. By the fourth day, I made a silent vow. I wouldn't let this betrayal define me. I wouldn't let it destroy me. I would survive. And when I was strong again, I would face my children, not with blind rage, but with the clarity of someone who had endured the unimaginable. Because the worst part of betrayal isn't losing something. It's losing the people who were supposed to be your refuge. And if I wanted to reclaim even a shred of peace, I would need more than anger. I would need strategy, patience, and courage I didn't know I had. That night, as I lay staring at the fluorescent ceiling, I realized something terrifying. I was no longer just a mother who had been betrayed. I was a woman whose life, trust, and home had been stolen while she was powerless to stop it. And the fight to reclaim my dignity, my house, and my children's respect was only beginning. I closed my eyes, feeling fear, grief, and determination swirling together. One thing was certain. I would not let them take everything from me without consequences. The story of betrayal had begun, and so had the story of survival. I woke up the next morning with a pounding headache and a sense of dread I could not shake. The sun had filtered weakly through the hospital blinds, but it brought no warmth, no comfort. My body was sore, weak, yet it was the betrayal that weighed heavier than the illness itself. I tried to sit up, but exhaustion and pain kept me pinned to the hospital bed. The phone remained silent at first, and part of me was grateful. I didn't want to hear anything. I didn't want to hear the voices of the children who had once depended on me, now replaced by the echo of their betrayal. But silence, too, was deafening. It allowed every memory of the house, every image of the life I had built with my own hands, to replay vividly and mercilessly in my mind. As I lay there, I thought about the first time I bought the house. It had been decades ago, a modest place with a small garden, but I had poured love into it. Every wall, every floorboard, every corner held a story. I had saved for years, scrimped and sacrificed, sometimes even going without, just to make sure my children had a home they could call safe. And now, while I was hospitalized, it had been sold from under me. The realization was bitter, like swallowing a cup of vinegar, and I wondered if my children even remembered what I had done for them, or if they had considered that their actions could leave a lifelong scar, not just on me, but on their own consciences. The first visit from my children after I regained enough strength to sit up came unexpectedly. I had braced myself for confrontation, for excuses, for feigned remorse, but what I got instead was indifference. They entered my hospital room with casual smiles, carrying what they called important documents and a stack of papers that confirmed the sale. They spoke as if discussing the weather, their voices light, unconcerned with the gravity of what they had done. I stared at them, disbelief mingled with horror, as they explained in detail the reasons why they had sold the house. They said it was necessary, practical, even helpful, citing bills, debts, and the cost of my hospital stay. They claimed it was in my best interest, but every word landed like a hammer against the fragile remains of trust I had clung to in the past few days. I wanted to yell, to cry, to throw myself across the bed and demand answers, but my body refused. Illness had rendered me weak, but the emotional exhaustion was heavier. I felt hollowed out, as if they had taken not just my home but my very essence. My children, whom I had loved beyond reason, had treated the home, and by extension me, as a commodity, something to be exchanged without regard for the person behind it. I realized in that moment that the betrayal was not just about the house. It was about respect, about the bonds that had been taken for granted, and about the realization that love without boundaries can be mistaken for weakness. Days passed in a blur of medical care, physical therapy, and sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling. I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, listening to the distant conversations in the hallway, noting the ebb and flow of hospital life, but nothing could distract me from the betrayal. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my children walking through the rooms of the house, signing papers, shaking hands, laughing casually, while I lay powerless, trusting them to protect what was mine. I replayed the moments leading up to this disaster in my mind, analyzing every decision I had made, every word I had spoken, trying to find some hint, some warning, some error on my part that could explain why they had done this. But there was none. I had given them everything with love, guidance, and patience. And yet, their choices had shown me a side of them I had never wanted to believe existed. The nurses noticed my withdrawn state. One approached cautiously, asking if I was feeling depressed or anxious. I smiled weakly, nodding and saying that it was just the stress of recovery. They didn't know. They couldn't know. They had no idea that the person responsible for this betrayal was not a distant relative or a stranger, but the children I had nurtured, protected, and cherished all my life. My children had sold my house while I was in the hospital, and with it, they had sold my sense of security, my belief in unconditional love, and the quiet certainty that family was supposed to mean loyalty. I thought about confronting them immediately, about demanding restitution, explanations, apologies, but I realized I couldn't, not physically, not emotionally. I was too weak, and my mind was too raw, so I began the slow, torturous process of planning. I needed clarity, patience, and strength before I could face them. I needed to rebuild myself before I could demand that they recognize the consequences of their actions. I could not allow my anger to dictate my next steps, otherwise I would lose more than just the house. I would lose my dignity, my sanity, and perhaps the last shred of hope that some part of them could still be guided back to decency. The next week was a blend of medical appointments and restless thinking. I would drift in and out of sleep, each time waking with new scenarios playing in my mind. I imagined confronting them in the hospital, in the house, at their workplaces. Each scenario varied slightly. Sometimes I yelled, sometimes I cried, sometimes I simply walked away. But in every imagined scenario, the weight of betrayal remained. They had underestimated me. They had assumed that my illness meant weakness. They had assumed that love without boundaries would allow them to take everything without consequence. They were wrong. Late one evening, after the hospital lights dimmed and the corridors were quiet, I allowed myself to cry. The tears were long overdue, pent up from days of restrained grief and simmering anger. I cried for the house I had lost, for the memories that were now out of reach, for the children who had betrayed the very foundation of our family. I cried not because I felt powerless, but because I was human. The tears cleared some of the fog from my mind, allowing me to see that my next steps needed to be deliberate. Emotional reactions could not serve me now. Strategy, patience, and resolve would. I began to document everything: phone calls, dates, actions, and communications. I wrote down every detail of the sale as I learned it, every conversation that hinted at betrayal, every small clue that I had overlooked. This meticulous recording gave me a sense of control in a situation where I had felt completely powerless. Each note, each observation, each memory filed away was a step toward reclaiming the life that had been stolen from me, and toward holding my children accountable, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. Even as I recovered physically, the shadow of betrayal lingered. The house was gone, yes, but the lesson was more profound. I learned that trust is fragile, that love can be misused, and that sometimes the people you nurture most can also hurt you the deepest. Yet in this realization, I also found determination. I would not crumble. I would not allow betrayal to define me. I would recover not just my health, but my strength, my independence, and ultimately my dignity. And so each day in the hospital became a battle not just for my body, but for my soul. Every moment of weakness was met with resolve, every pang of grief answered with planning. I visualized the confrontation, the recovery, the reclamation, not just of my house, but of my life. The betrayal had been sharp, cruel, and immediate, but it had also awakened something in me that I had long forgotten, the unyielding resilience of a person who refuses to be broken, no matter the cost. Even after leaving the hospital, I felt like I was walking through a fog. The world outside had moved on while I was trapped in a haze of illness and betrayal. The streets I once strolled down freely now felt unfamiliar, as though the life I had known belonged to someone else. I returned to my temporary apartment, a small rented space far from the house my children had sold. It was modest, plain, lacking warmth, but it was mine, in the sense that I had chosen it, and no one could take it away without my consent. And yet every corner reminded me of the loss. Every empty wall echoed memories of rooms that no longer belonged to me. I began to spend my days planning. Not revenge, not yet, but understanding, questioning, and slowly, strategically preparing. I needed to know why my children had done this. Was it greed, thoughtlessness, or something deeper? My son had always been pragmatic, calculating, and my daughter, the one I had thought would follow the same moral compass as I did, had always been opportunistic in subtle ways. But the complete audacity of their decision stunned me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the betrayal was layered. It was not only financial, it was emotional, a statement of disregard that cut deeper than any words could. I started by reviewing the papers I had been given in the hospital. The legal documents were filled with signatures, dates, and notarizations. My children had prepared everything meticulously, making sure the transaction was legitimate and irreversible. There was no oversight, no loophole to exploit. They had thought of everything, except perhaps the consequences. I studied the details again and again, noting dates, signatures, even the sequence of communications. Every line felt like a cold echo of the love I had poured into raising them. Each signature a reminder of how far they had drifted from the values I had tried to instill. As days turned into weeks, I began writing letters I never intended to send. Letters to my children, letters to myself, letters to the house that had been sold. In these letters, I expressed my confusion, my pain, my anger, and, oddly, my lingering love. The act of writing was a form of therapy, a way to release some of the pressure building inside me. I described every corner of the house, every memory attached to it, and how it felt to have it taken from me without warning. I poured out years of nurturing, of sleepless nights and endless sacrifices, into these unsent letters. And though my children would never read them, the process helped me reclaim a small part of myself. I also began documenting everything else: financial transactions, calls, messages. Each entry was meticulous, detailed, factual. I could no longer trust anyone, not even the people who claimed to be helping. My own memory was clouded with pain, and I needed a record, a way to see the betrayal clearly, without distortion. This documentation became my shield and my weapon. The more I wrote, the more I realized that knowledge was power. I might have lost the house physically, but I could reclaim moral and emotional authority. During this time, I also began to reconnect with old friends. Those I had neglected over the years, busy raising children and managing a household, became my lifeline. They offered advice, comfort, and sometimes just a listening ear. And through their perspective, I began to see the situation more clearly. My children's actions, while shocking, were not incomprehensible. They were human, and human beings can be selfish, short-sighted, and cruel, even to those who love them most. This realization did not soften the betrayal, but it gave me a framework to understand it. Understanding, I realized, was the first step toward reclaiming control. I began to rebuild my physical strength as well. Morning walks, stretches, and careful exercises became a ritual. Each step I took felt symbolic, an assertion that I was still here, still alive, still capable. Physical recovery went hand in hand with emotional fortitude. Every day I forced myself to move forward, I felt a small spark of power returning. My body was healing, yes, but more importantly, my mind was sharpening. Then came the first encounter. My daughter called one evening, her tone casual, almost rehearsed. "Mom, I wanted to check in," she said. I paused before answering. Part of me wanted to scream, to accuse, to break down, but I didn't. Instead, I replied evenly, carefully. "I'm doing fine," I said. She pressed, asking questions about my health, my apartment, my recovery. I answered each politely, never giving away my knowledge of her deliberate betrayal. Her voice, once so comforting, now grated on me. Each word was a reminder of the audacity of her actions. But I realized something crucial in that moment. Responding with emotion would give her power. My anger, my grief, my desperation, they were all weapons she could use against me. I would not give her that. Calmness, composure, and careful calculation would be my allies. I spent hours thinking about confrontation strategies. If I were to face my children directly, I needed more than anger. I needed a plan, a way to assert moral authority without losing control. I researched legal options, spoke to advisors, and even considered mediation, not necessarily to recover the house, but to hold them accountable. Every scenario played out in my mind, every possibility weighed carefully. The betrayal had been sudden, cruel, and deliberate, but my response would be measured, strategic, and decisive. One night, as I sat at my small kitchen table in the rented apartment, a notebook in front of me, I wrote down a single phrase repeatedly: control what you can, endure what you cannot. It became a mantra, something to recite whenever despair threatened to overwhelm me. I had no illusions about undoing the sale or reversing time, but I could control my response, my actions, and ultimately, my dignity. In that, I found a small but significant comfort. As weeks passed, I began to notice subtle changes in my children's behavior. Calls were less frequent, tones slightly uneasy. Perhaps they realized that their actions had consequences beyond the immediate gain of the house. Perhaps they sensed that I was no longer the powerless, weak figure they had assumed I was during my illness. Regardless, I did not reach out to them first. I allowed them to feel the weight of their choices, knowing that true reckoning cannot be forced, it must be experienced. During this period, I also revisited old memories of the house. I would walk through the streets near where it had been, imagining each room, each window, each garden corner. The physical space was gone, but the emotional imprint remained. I realized that while they had taken my house, they could not erase the memories, the lessons, and the strength I had developed over decades. The house was a vessel of my past, but I, the person who had nurtured it, remained intact. And so, slowly, the pain began to shift from raw, jagged agony to a simmering resolve. I was no longer just a victim of betrayal. I was a survivor, strategizing, planning, and reclaiming the parts of myself that had been threatened. Each day, each exercise, each careful action reinforced my independence. I had learned that betrayal does not define the person betrayed. It is the response that determines whether one rises or falls. The turning point came when I realized that waiting for them to apologize, to feel remorse, or to make restitution was futile. If I wanted justice, respect, and peace, I would have to assert it myself. I began reaching out to legal counsel, gathering documentation, and preparing for the confrontation that would inevitably come. But even as I did, I reminded myself that the goal was not revenge. It was accountability, clarity, and reclaiming control over a life temporarily stolen from me. Each day was a balancing act between health and strategy, grief and planning, love and judgment. The betrayal had been profound, but it had awakened a strength I had forgotten existed. I understood now that the fight was not just about the house. It was about reclaiming the power, dignity, and agency that my children had taken for granted. By the end of the month, I had a plan. Not just a legal strategy, but a personal one. I would confront them, yes, but on my terms. I would demand accountability, not apologies. I would reclaim my life even if the house itself was beyond reach, and I would do it with the clarity and composure that only someone who had been truly betrayed can muster. I realized that this was only the beginning. The sale of the house had been the spark, the catalyst that revealed the cracks in family bonds I had long assumed were unbreakable. But now, with careful planning, patience, and unwavering determination, I could face them, not as a victim, but as someone who had endured, survived, and emerged stronger. I moved carefully through my apartment that morning, the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant traffic outside providing a strange sense of normalcy. It was a normal day, yet nothing about it felt normal. The house I had lived in for decades, the space where my children had played, laughed, and even fought, no longer belonged to me. Every object I looked at in my temporary apartment, no matter how simple or mundane, reminded me of what I had lost. Even the walls, bare and pale, felt like a subtle accusation. You are alone now. You cannot rely on anyone. I sipped tea slowly, letting the warmth fill the emptiness that had been gnawing at me since my return from the hospital. But comfort was fleeting. My mind drifted back to the phone call I had received weeks ago. My daughter's tone, so calm and rehearsed, haunted me. My son's casual mention of the finalized sale replayed endlessly in my thoughts, each repetition like a needle pressing into my heart. How could they have done this while I was weak, vulnerable, and unable to stop them? I tried to rationalize, tried to find some reason that could explain their actions, but there was none. They had chosen greed and convenience over family, and the stark reality was that I had to face that truth. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. An old friend, someone who had known my family long before my children's betrayal, knocked on the door, concern etched into every line of their face. I heard about the hospital, about everything, they said softly, eyes glistening with empathy. I didn't know whether to cry or to nod stiffly. I invited them in, and we sat in silence for a long while. Finally, I spoke, not just about the house, but about the betrayal, the feeling of being replaced, the loss of trust. It was exhausting to vocalize, to put words to something so raw and personal. Yet it also felt relieving. To speak aloud, to acknowledge the pain, was the first step in reclaiming some part of myself that had been buried under weeks of grief and anger. We talked for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes in small bursts of conversation. My friend reminded me that betrayal, while devastating, does not define the betrayed. I clung to that thought, letting it sink deep into my consciousness. Slowly, I began to map out a plan, not just for confronting my children, but for reconstructing my life, for creating boundaries that could no longer be crossed. If I had learned anything, it was that love without limits can be dangerous, and trust, once broken, cannot simply be taken for granted again. In the following days, I dedicated myself to rebuilding both physically and mentally. Mornings were spent on gentle exercises and short walks, each step reinforcing my independence. Afternoons were devoted to careful research and documentation, reviewing contracts, consulting legal advice, noting every communication and transaction related to the sale. It was meticulous work, but necessary. I needed to arm myself with facts, with clarity, and with the moral authority that could not be challenged. Evenings, however, were the hardest. That was when memories returned most vividly. I would imagine walking through the rooms of my old house, the living room where my children had built blanket forts, the kitchen where countless meals had been prepared, the bedrooms filled with toys and laughter. Each memory was bittersweet. They were precious moments, yet now tainted by the knowledge that my children had been willing to erase them for personal gain. The emotional weight was heavy, pressing down on me in waves that left me both exhausted and determined. One evening, I received a call from my son. The timing was precise, almost calculated. "Mom," he said, voice light, casual, "I wanted to check on you. How are you feeling?" I paused, sensing that this was more than just concern. There was a subtle undertone, a test perhaps, or an attempt to measure my reaction. I answered evenly, carefully. "I am recovering," I said. "Thank you for asking." His tone didn't change, but I could sense the slight shift, the faint unease beneath the practiced calm. I had become stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. My composure was a weapon he could not anticipate, and I intended to keep it that way. I began preparing mentally for a more direct confrontation. I needed to set boundaries, to assert authority, to demand recognition of the consequences of their actions. But I also knew that confrontation required patience and timing. If I approached them too early, too aggressively, I risked escalation and emotional derailment. If I delayed too long, the impact might be diminished. I carefully considered each scenario, each possible response, and mapped out strategies that balanced assertiveness with calculated control. This planning became a daily ritual, a form of therapy in itself. During this time, I also reflected on my role in the situation. Had I been too trusting, too lenient? Could I have anticipated such betrayal? These questions were difficult to answer, but necessary. The goal was not self-blame, but understanding. I realized that my children's actions were not solely reflections of their character, they were also consequences of choices, patterns, and values that I had cultivated over decades. Understanding this did not absolve them, but it allowed me to approach the situation with a clearer perspective. Weeks passed, and my strength increased. I could walk further, think more clearly, and manage my emotions more effectively. My children began to sense a shift. Calls were less frequent, tones more cautious. I did not reach out to them first, allowing them to feel the weight of their choices. I wanted them to understand that actions have consequences and that betrayal cannot simply be ignored. It was a delicate balance, allowing distance without completely severing contact, asserting authority without provoking unnecessary conflict. One afternoon, I visited the neighborhood where my house had been. I walked slowly down the familiar streets, noting changes, imagining rooms and spaces that were no longer mine. The physical presence of the house was gone, replaced by new owners, unfamiliar faces, and different energy. Yet, the emotional imprint remained. I realized that while my children had taken the house, they could not erase the memories, the experiences, or the lessons I had instilled in them. The house was a symbol, but the real strength lay within me. In the evenings, I continued to write letters I never intended to send, letters to my children, letters to myself, letters to the house. Each letter contained reflections, questions, and expressions of grief and hope. I found solace in the act of writing, in giving shape to emotions that were otherwise intangible. The letters served as a record, a means of processing, and a way to prepare for the eventual confrontation. I realized that clarity and articulation would be essential in maintaining control and asserting moral authority when the time came. By the end of the month, I had established routines, regained strength, and organized my thoughts. I knew that facing my children would be difficult, but I also understood that avoidance would only prolong suffering. I resolved to approach the situation not with uncontrolled anger, but with deliberate calm, precision, and unwavering focus. The betrayal had been severe, but it had also awakened a resilience I had long forgotten. I was no longer a passive victim. I was an active participant in reclaiming my life and asserting the respect I deserved. Even as I prepared, doubts and fears occasionally surfaced. What if they refused to listen? What if the confrontation escalated into hostility? What if my health faltered under the stress? Each fear was acknowledged, examined, and then set aside. I could not control their actions, but I could control mine. That understanding became a cornerstone of my strategy, a foundation on which I built my confidence and resolve. The turning point came unexpectedly one evening. My son called, his tone unusually hesitant. He asked about my health, my daily activities, even my emotional state. I responded carefully, providing necessary information but withholding any sign of weakness or vulnerability. I could sense that he was testing, probing, searching for a response that would indicate control or submission. But I remained calm, composed, and deliberate. In that moment, I realized that the power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer powerless. I had endured, observed, and planned. I had regained strength, clarity, and purpose. In the following days, I continued to document everything, refine strategies, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation. Each note, each plan, each reflection reinforced my determination. I understood that the house was more than a physical structure. It represented security, trust, and the bonds of family. While it had been taken, the principles it symbolized were still within my grasp. I could reclaim dignity, respect, and agency, even if the property itself remained beyond reach. By the time I felt ready, I had transformed. The hospital-bound, betrayed, and powerless person I had been was gone. In her place stood a woman who had endured, reflected, and prepared. My children had underestimated me, assuming weakness, ignorance, or submission. They would soon discover that betrayal cannot silence or diminish those who are determined to reclaim control and demand accountability. The morning sunlight spilled through the curtains, painting stripes of warmth across the floor. But I felt none of it. The world outside my window seemed ordinary, calm, and indifferent, while my life had been upended in the cruelest of ways. I had spent weeks preparing, planning, and reflecting, yet nothing could make the act of facing my children less daunting. Each day, I rehearsed in my mind every word I might say, every tone I might use, every response I might receive. This was not just a confrontation about a house. It was a reckoning, a test of boundaries, respect, and the values I had spent decades instilling. I knew I had to be strategic. To confront them impulsively would be to surrender the very control I had fought to reclaim. I could feel the simmering anger within me, a powerful, volatile force, but I forced myself to channel it into patience. Patience was now my weapon. I began by drafting a letter I would not send immediately, outlining every detail of the betrayal, the timing, the legal documents, the casualness with which they had executed the sale. Each sentence was deliberate, each phrase chosen to reflect not just my hurt, but my awareness, my power, and my resolve. This letter became a touchstone, a framework to clarify my thoughts and prepare for what would be a long, emotionally charged process. The first time I spoke to my son after this period of reflection, I did so with calculated calm. I asked about his life, his work, and his family. His voice carried a subtle unease, almost imperceptible, but I recognized it immediately. For the first time since the betrayal, I sensed that my presence, my composure, and my awareness unsettled him. It was a small victory, but an important one. I responded with polite neutrality, never betraying the storm inside me, only allowing hints of controlled disappointment to surface in measured ways. I realized then that my power did not come from anger or tears, but from control. The control to act, to choose, and to respond deliberately rather than react impulsively. In the days that followed, I began to compile documentation more rigorously. Legal documents, financial records, communications, and timelines were organized meticulously. Each entry reminded me of the reality I faced, but also strengthened my sense of agency. I was no longer passive. I was preparing for accountability, not revenge. I understood that holding them accountable would require both evidence and clarity of purpose. This process, although exhausting, was empowering. It reminded me that although they had taken my house, they could not take my mind, my resolve, or my dignity. One evening, while reviewing documents, I paused to reflect on the moments that had led to this betrayal. Childhood memories of my children surfaced, filled with warmth and innocence. I remembered teaching them to ride bikes, celebrating birthdays with handmade cakes, staying up late to help with school projects. Each memory was bittersweet now, tainted by the knowledge that those I had nurtured had acted with such disregard. And yet, I realized that the love I had given was not wasted. It had shaped them, even if they had strayed. The challenge was to guide them back, or at least make them recognize the consequences of their choices. Weeks later, I arranged a meeting with a trusted legal advisor. We discussed options, not just for financial restitution, but for mediation and accountability. The advisor emphasized the importance of clear communication, preparation, and emotional restraint. We rehearsed scenarios, anticipating excuses, deflections, and rationalizations my children might use. Each session strengthened my confidence. I began to feel that the confrontation would not break me. It would reveal the depth of their understanding, or lack thereof, and allow me to reclaim authority over my life and decisions. The night before the meeting, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, reviewing everything in my mind. I imagined their reactions: defiance, guilt, surprise, or even denial. I rehearsed my responses carefully, weighing each word for tone and impact. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of rooms I once owned, memories of laughter and conflict, and the stark awareness of betrayal. Yet, amidst the turmoil, I felt a growing certainty. I was prepared, strong, and capable of facing them, no matter the outcome. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully, choosing attire that reflected composure, authority, and self-respect. I did not want to intimidate them, but I wanted to convey that I was no longer the person they had assumed was powerless in the hospital bed. I arrived early, nerves coiled like steel springs, ready for whatever would unfold. My advisor met me outside the building, offering a reassuring nod. Together we walked in, documents in hand, hearts steady with resolve. As we entered the conference room, my children were already there, seated with casual expressions that belied the gravity of the situation. I took a deep breath, centering myself, and addressed them directly, calmly but firmly. "We are here to discuss the sale of the house," I began, allowing the weight of those words to settle in the room. "I want to understand why you made this decision without consulting me." The silence that followed was telling. Their faces shifted, eyes darting, subtle signs of discomfort emerging. My son spoke first, attempting to rationalize the sale, citing financial concerns, bills, and supposed practicality. My daughter added her perspective, emphasizing what she claimed was consideration for my well-being. Each argument, each excuse only reinforced my resolve. I listened, nodded, and calmly refuted points where necessary, relying on documentation and facts rather than emotion. The conversation was long, emotionally charged, but measured. I refrained from raising my voice, from tearing at their defenses, from letting anger dictate my words. Instead, I focused on clarity, precision, and accountability. Each point I made was supported by evidence, each question aimed at understanding motivations and highlighting the consequences of their actions. I watched their composure falter subtly, realizing that the controlled calm I projected was more powerful than any outburst or confrontation could have been. As the meeting progressed, I noticed moments of hesitation, flashes of guilt, and glimpses of awareness. They were beginning to understand, slowly and unevenly, that their choices had consequences beyond immediate gain. The house was gone, yes, but the moral authority, the acknowledgement of betrayal, and the recognition of my endurance were still mine. I could see that the weight of realization was pressing upon them, and for the first time, I felt a small sense of vindication, not from malice, but from the affirmation of truth and justice. After hours of discussion, we concluded the meeting with clear boundaries established. My children would not undo the sale, but they would acknowledge the breach of trust and engage in measures to ensure my security and dignity were respected moving forward. While the material loss remained, the acknowledgement and understanding represented a significant step toward repair. I left the room with a sense of accomplishment, a quiet satisfaction that the confrontation had been managed with authority, clarity, and restraint. In the days that followed, I focused on restoring stability to my life. I reinforced routines, continued physical recovery, and nurtured relationships with friends and allies who had supported me. The betrayal by my children remained a painful chapter, but it no longer dominated my consciousness. I had confronted it, established boundaries, and reclaimed agency over my decisions and emotions. The process had taught me invaluable lessons about trust, resilience, and the nature of relationships. Love, I realized, must be balanced with boundaries, and trust must be accompanied by accountability. The house, once a symbol of security, had become a catalyst for growth, clarity, and empowerment. I had survived betrayal, reclaimed strength, and set the foundation for healthier, more conscious interactions with those I loved. And as I walked through my apartment, organizing, cleaning, and reflecting, I understood that the journey was far from over. Healing is a process, and while confrontation had provided closure in one sense, the work of rebuilding trust, understanding, and respect, both within myself and with my children, would continue. But I was no longer afraid. I was prepared. I was strong, and I was determined to protect the life, dignity, and peace that remained mine, no matter what challenges lay ahead. After the confrontation, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't relief exactly, because the loss of the house remained, a stark reminder of betrayal that couldn't be erased. But it was something else, something heavier, stronger, a sense of regained control. I had faced my children, asserted my boundaries, and refused to be diminished. That day in the conference room became a turning point, a moment when I realized that although they had taken my home, they could never take my resilience or the authority I had over my own life. The following days were quieter, yet the air remained thick with tension. My children called less frequently, and when they did, their voices carried hesitation and an unfamiliar undercurrent of respect. It was subtle but unmistakable. I sensed that the confrontation had unsettled them in ways that no argument, no scolding could have. They were beginning to understand that my calm, measured approach was not weakness, it was power. And power, I realized, demanded acknowledgement. I focused on rebuilding my life, not only in a physical sense, but emotionally and mentally as well. I arranged my small apartment to feel more like home, filling it with familiar items that brought comfort, memories that were mine, and objects that reminded me of the person I had always been. I tended to my small balcony garden, nurturing plants as I had once nurtured my family. Each new bloom, each sprouting leaf, became a symbol of renewal, of life persisting despite hardship. It was therapeutic, grounding me in the reality that while material loss could not be undone, growth and resilience were always possible. In parallel, I sought counsel from legal and financial advisors. Although I had no intention of reversing the sale, I wanted to ensure that my remaining assets and resources were protected. I reviewed bank statements, estate documents, and insurance policies, verifying that no further unilateral decisions could jeopardize my security. It was a meticulous, sometimes exhausting process, but it empowered me. Knowledge, I realized, was an unassailable form of protection. The more I understood, the less vulnerable I felt. Evenings were reserved for reflection and writing. I continued to compose letters to my children, though still unsent, detailing my thoughts, feelings, and the lessons I hoped they would eventually internalize. Writing became a ritual, a way to process lingering anger, disappointment, and grief. It allowed me to articulate truths that were too complex or painful to express aloud. Each letter was an act of reclaiming my voice, of asserting moral authority, and of affirming my dignity. One night, as I was writing, I realized the depth of change within me. The woman who had entered the hospital weeks before, weak, betrayed, and vulnerable, was no longer the person I saw in the mirror. My eyes reflected determination, clarity, and a tempered strength forged through adversity. The betrayal, while devastating, had become a crucible, shaping me into someone who could navigate complexity, confront injustice calmly, and protect herself without losing empathy or integrity. Days turned into weeks, and gradually routines began to stabilize. I returned to social activities, reconnecting with friends and neighbors, rebuilding a support system that had weakened during my illness and the upheaval surrounding the house. These connections were a lifeline, offering perspective, comfort, and sometimes necessary counsel. I realized that while my children's betrayal had been profound, it did not define my relationships or my capacity to trust wisely. Boundaries were now clearer, and trust was no longer assumed, it was earned. Unexpectedly, my daughter reached out one afternoon. Her tone was tentative, careful. "Mom," she said, "I wanted to check in. Are you okay?" I paused, considering my response. Part of me longed for reconciliation, for acknowledgement, for some sign of genuine remorse. But I had learned the importance of measured interaction. "I am doing well," I replied evenly, withholding neither warmth nor judgment, maintaining the composure I had cultivated. Her hesitation was telling. She was testing, perhaps wondering if I had softened, if I had become vulnerable again. I understood the game and did not allow myself to be manipulated. The interaction reinforced a key lesson. Control does not come from dominance, but from composure and clarity. I was learning to navigate interactions with my children, not as a reactive parent, but as a measured adult who had endured betrayal, reflected on it, and was now capable of asserting authority without hostility. It was a delicate balance, showing firmness without cruelty, strength without vindictiveness, love without naivete. Each conversation became a test of this newfound equilibrium. Simultaneously, I devoted time to personal development. I explored hobbies and interests I had set aside while managing the household, health, and family obligations. Painting, reading, and volunteering became avenues for self-expression, fulfillment, and connection. I realized that reclaiming my life involved more than confronting betrayal. It required nurturing my own identity, passions, and purpose beyond the roles I had occupied for decades. This internal rebuilding was slow, often painful, but immensely rewarding. One afternoon, I received an unexpected letter from a neighbor of my former home. They had purchased the property and wrote to express awareness of the emotional significance the house held for me. They assured me they would respect the legacy, treat the home with care, and preserve its character. Reading this letter stirred complex emotions: relief, gratitude, and subtle sadness. While the material loss remained, the symbolic gesture reminded me that memory and respect can persist beyond transactions. It was a small yet meaningful form of closure, reinforcing the idea that even in loss, dignity can endure. In parallel, I maintained meticulous records of all interactions with my children, documenting calls, emails, and meetings. Each record provided clarity and reinforced boundaries. I understood that accountability required both memory and evidence, not just moral assertion. By maintaining a detailed account, I ensured that any future interactions would be guided by facts rather than emotion, safeguarding myself from further manipulation or disregard. Gradually, I observed subtle shifts in my children's behavior. Their voices grew cautious, their attempts to engage more deliberate. It was not complete remorse, nor full acknowledgement, but there was recognition, an understanding that my strength and composure had shifted the dynamic. I did not take satisfaction in guilt. Rather, I took comfort in the awareness that the breach of trust had consequences, and that moral accountability, even if delayed, was beginning to manifest. Weeks turned into months, and my health routines and emotional states stabilized. I continued to nurture my small garden, write letters, and build personal projects. Each step reinforced autonomy, clarity, and resilience. I realized that betrayal, while painful, had catalyzed a transformation I would not have achieved otherwise. I had learned to navigate relationships with caution and wisdom, to assert boundaries firmly, and to reclaim power without losing compassion or perspective. The journey was far from over, but I had achieved a critical milestone. I had confronted my children, established accountability, and reclaimed control over my life. The house, though lost, had become a symbol of both loss and growth, a reminder of the resilience, strategy, and inner strength that betrayal had uncovered. By the end of this phase, I was no longer defined by the actions of my children. I had reclaimed my narrative, reinforced my identity, and prepared for future interactions with composure, authority, and clarity. The path forward would involve continued vigilance, emotional intelligence, and self-care, but I faced it with determination, knowing that survival, dignity, and empowerment were now firmly within my grasp. And as I walked through my apartment one evening, arranging books and plants, I understood a profound truth. Material loss can wound deeply, but resilience, clarity, and integrity are impervious to theft. The betrayal by those closest to me had tested every fiber of my being, yet it had also illuminated a capacity for strength I had never fully recognized. I was ready for whatever came next, not as a victim, but as someone who had endured, reflected, and emerged stronger. Life, after the confrontation, settled into a rhythm that was both comforting and challenging. The immediate storm had passed, but the aftermath lingered. The betrayal of my children had left deep cracks, not only in the structure of my life, but in the framework of my trust. Each morning, I woke with a mixture of relief and tension. Relief, because I had survived, confronted, and asserted boundaries. Tension, because the journey of healing and rebuilding trust, both in myself and with my children, was far from complete. I spent the first part of the day reviewing correspondence and financial details. Each document, each record, served as a reminder that accountability is grounded in clarity. I no longer reacted impulsively or emotionally. Instead, I approached every situation with a calm precision that had taken weeks to cultivate. My children had assumed that hospitalization equaled weakness. They'd assumed that love without limits would prevent me from defending myself, but their assumptions were misguided. The process of planning, documenting, and reflecting had transformed me into someone who was prepared, steadfast, and deliberate. The afternoons were dedicated to personal projects and restoration of my inner life. I began revisiting old interests that had been sidelined during decades of family obligations. I painted, read extensively, and even started volunteering in community activities. Each action, each commitment, reinforced the understanding that life was larger than any single betrayal. The house had been lost, yes, but my identity, creativity, and purpose remained intact, growing stronger with each passing day. In the evenings, I allowed myself to process emotions that surfaced unexpectedly. Sometimes it was anger, sharp and consuming. Other times it was sorrow, quiet but deep. I did not suppress these feelings. Instead, I wrote them down in letters I would never send, recorded them in journals, and reflected on their origin. The act of acknowledging emotions rather than denying them became a cornerstone of my emotional resilience. I learned to separate my feelings from my decisions, allowing me to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. My children continued to reach out sporadically. Calls were cautious, sometimes awkward, sometimes hesitant. I responded with politeness but maintained my composure. I had learned that control was not about intimidation or punishment, it was about presence, clarity, and consistency. By maintaining equilibrium, I ensured that interactions were guided by principle, not emotion. Each exchange reinforced the boundaries I had established, and I noticed subtle shifts in their behavior. They were beginning to recognize, in small ways, the consequences of their actions. One afternoon, an unexpected letter arrived. It was from a distant relative who had learned of the situation. The tone was empathetic, compassionate, and filled with advice. They emphasized the importance of maintaining boundaries, of focusing on personal recovery, and of protecting both emotional and financial well-being. Their words reinforced the strategies I had been developing: vigilance, preparation, and measured responses. The support, though indirect, was deeply validating. It reminded me that though my children had failed me, I was not alone in navigating the aftermath of betrayal. Over the next weeks, I intensified my focus on legal and financial protection. I reviewed every account, policy, and document that could impact my security. Although I had no intention of reversing the house sale, I wanted to ensure that my resources were safeguarded against any future unilateral decisions by my children. The act of taking control over these elements was empowering. It reminded me that while others may attempt to exert power through betrayal, personal diligence and preparation are unassailable forms of defense. I also began to reflect deeply on the nature of my relationship with my children. It was no longer enough to see them simply as betrayers or offenders. They were complex individuals, shaped by upbringing, experiences, and choices. Understanding this complexity did not excuse their actions, but it allowed me to approach future interactions with both caution and clarity. I realized that reconciliation, if it were possible, would require careful navigation, emotional intelligence, and firm boundaries. Social interactions became an important part of my healing process. I reconnected with friends, neighbors, and former colleagues, gradually rebuilding a network of support. Each conversation, each shared meal, each casual outing reinforced a sense of normalcy and belonging. These interactions reminded me that life extends beyond the confines of betrayal, that trust can be rebuilt selectively, and that personal growth continues even after profound setbacks. The more I engaged with my external world, the clearer I became about the values I wanted to maintain in my relationships. I identified traits I could no longer tolerate: disregard for consent, lack of accountability, and casual exploitation of trust. I also identified the strengths I wanted to nurture: empathy balanced with boundaries, resilience, clarity, and self-respect. This self-awareness became a compass, guiding decisions about interactions with both family and the wider community. Unexpectedly, my son initiated contact. His tone was measured, cautious, almost tentative. He inquired about my health and well-being, attempting conversation on neutral topics. I responded politely but without revealing vulnerability. I could sense that he was testing boundaries, trying to gauge whether I had softened or whether I was still emotionally fragile. I maintained my composure, answering calmly, and subtly reinforcing the notion that while I could engage, respect and accountability were prerequisites. Over time, the dynamics shifted gradually. My children's casual confidence gave way to cautious recognition of my presence and authority. I was no longer the passive parent they had assumed would acquiesce to their decisions. They were beginning to understand, in subtle ways, that their actions had consequences that extended beyond immediate material gain. The realization was slow, uneven, and incomplete, but it marked progress. One evening, I reflected on the cumulative changes in my life. The betrayal of my children, while devastating, had catalyzed growth, resilience, and clarity. I had faced confrontation, established boundaries, and reclaimed authority over my life. The house, though lost, had become a symbol not of defeat, but of transformation. I had learned to navigate betrayal with composure, to assert moral authority, and to protect my well-being without succumbing to reactive emotions. I continued to cultivate routines that reinforced independence and resilience. Gardening, reading, painting, and volunteering became integral parts of my daily life. Each activity contributed to emotional stability, mental clarity, and a sense of purpose. I realized that personal empowerment, rather than revenge or resentment, was the most profound response to betrayal. In quiet moments, I revisited memories of the house, not with longing or bitterness, but with reflection. Each room, each corner, each memory was a testament to decades of effort, care, and love. Though the physical structure was no longer mine, the emotional imprint remained intact. The lessons, experiences, and values cultivated within those walls could never be taken. They were mine to carry forward, shaping my character and guiding my future interactions. The journey was far from over. Challenges remained in maintaining boundaries, navigating interactions, and fostering understanding with my children. Yet, I faced these challenges with a sense of preparedness and strength that had been forged through adversity. Each decision, each conversation, each reflection reinforced the central truth: betrayal, while painful, cannot define the person who has endured, reflected, and emerged stronger. And as I sat one evening, looking out over the city skyline, I recognized a deeper transformation. The betrayal had forced me to confront vulnerability, loss, and disappointment, but it had also revealed resilience, clarity, and determination. I was no longer defined by the actions of my children, nor by the loss of a house. I was defined by my response, my strength, and my capacity to rebuild, protect, and assert myself with wisdom and integrity. The seasons shifted outside my apartment window, yet inside, my life was beginning to regain a rhythm that was both comforting and empowering. Days were no longer consumed by immediate pain or reactive emotion. Instead, they were measured, intentional, and filled with small victories. Each morning, I walked to the nearby park, feeling the crisp air on my face, noticing the gentle rise of trees, the distant laughter of children, and the hum of life moving forward. These small moments reminded me that despite the betrayal I had endured, the world continued, and I had a place within it, not as a victim, but as someone reclaiming autonomy and purpose. I continued to fortify my mental and emotional resilience. Meditation became a daily practice, allowing me to observe my thoughts without judgment, to recognize triggers, and to maintain composure even when memories of the house, my children's betrayal, or the hospital resurfaced. I journaled extensively, recording insights, observations, and strategies for handling future interactions. Each entry was a blend of reflection, planning, and affirmation, an ongoing process of reclaiming control over my emotional landscape. Interactions with my children became increasingly structured. Calls and messages were acknowledged, but I responded only on my terms. I had learned that emotional reaction would give them leverage. Patience, clarity, and consistency, however, were powerful tools in reasserting authority. They began to test boundaries, sometimes indirectly, with casual remarks or veiled questions about my living situation. Each time, I responded calmly, factually, and without defensiveness. My demeanor was a quiet but undeniable assertion of power. They could not unsettle me with manipulation or guilt. I also began reaching out more intentionally to old friends and relatives. These relationships had been neglected over the years due to family obligations, illness, and the upheaval surrounding the house. Now, reconnecting brought not only emotional support, but also perspective. Listening to others' experiences with betrayal, reconciliation, and personal growth helped me refine my own understanding and approach. I realized that support networks are invaluable when navigating complex familial dynamics, providing both practical guidance and moral reinforcement. Legal and financial diligence remained a priority. While I had no intention of reversing the house sale, I carefully reviewed all remaining assets, accounts, and insurance policies. Every document was scrutinized, and I established safeguards to prevent further unilateral decisions by my children. This meticulous attention to detail provided reassurance, protecting my independence and reinforcing the principle that responsibility and accountability must be mutual in family relationships. One afternoon, my daughter requested a meeting. Her tone was careful, almost hesitant, signaling an awareness of the boundaries I had established. "Mom," she said, "I think we need to talk about everything. What happened? What's next?" I agreed, aware that this conversation could be pivotal. I prepared mentally, reviewing past interactions, documenting evidence, and considering the emotional dynamics at play. My goal was not confrontation for its own sake, but clarity, accountability, and the possibility of rebuilding, cautiously and deliberately. The meeting began in a neutral location, a small cafe with private seating. We sat across from each other, the air charged with unspoken tension. I observed her body language, tone, and choice of words carefully, noting where discomfort, guilt, or defensiveness surfaced. I spoke first, calmly and with precision. I outlined the facts, the hospital, the house sale, the breach of trust, and the steps I had taken to protect myself. My voice was measured, controlled, reflecting both authority and composure. She responded, attempting to justify past actions, citing financial pressures and practicality. I listened without interruption, nodding occasionally to acknowledge her perspective. But I did not accept excuses that diminished the gravity of betrayal. I gently, yet firmly, highlighted the consequences of her choices, not in anger, but in terms of accountability, emotional responsibility, and respect. The conversation was long and challenging, but I remained steady, ensuring that my position was clear without being adversarial. By the end of the discussion, a subtle shift occurred. My daughter's tone softened, the defensive edge easing slightly. She acknowledged in measured terms that her actions had caused pain and disruption. While complete remorse was not immediate, there was recognition. For the first time, I felt that the boundaries I had established were being respected, that accountability was not theoretical but beginning to manifest. I left the meeting with a sense of cautious optimism, understanding that reconciliation would require continued vigilance, structured communication, and patience. In the weeks that followed, I continued to reinforce routines that promoted independence and emotional stability. Gardening, volunteering, writing, and social engagements became anchors, providing structure, fulfillment, and a sense of purpose. Each day was a step toward reclaiming not only my life, but also the autonomy, dignity, and self-respect that had been challenged by the betrayal. Unexpectedly, my son reached out next. His approach was tentative, more measured than before. He inquired about my health, daily activities, and emotional well-being. I responded politely, providing information without revealing vulnerability. I maintained composure, ensuring that he could not manipulate or unsettle me. The dynamic had shifted. The power balance was no longer assumed by them. It was being consciously reinforced by my clarity, patience, and consistent boundaries. Over time, both children began to adjust their behavior. Casual assumptions of control gave way to cautious recognition of my authority and presence. They were beginning to understand, slowly and unevenly, that their actions had consequences beyond immediate gain. While full reconciliation was distant, acknowledgement and measured engagement marked progress. I observed their interactions with a sense of strategic patience, reinforcing positive changes while maintaining boundaries to prevent further overreach. I also reflected deeply on my personal growth. The betrayal, while painful, had catalyzed resilience, clarity, and strategic thinking. I had learned to navigate relationships with caution, assert boundaries firmly, and engage in deliberate communication rather than reactive emotion. The process had strengthened my self-awareness, reinforced my values, and cultivated a deeper understanding of human behavior, particularly in moments of conflict and betrayal. One evening, as I walked through the park, I noticed a family enjoying a picnic, children laughing and running freely. The scene was both familiar and poignant, reminding me of the life I had nurtured and the love I had given. Yet, rather than fueling bitterness, it evoked reflection. I understood that the lessons learned through betrayal were now part of my own growth. I could love wisely, trust selectively, and assert myself without fear of manipulation or loss. Months passed, and my life stabilized further. Health improved, routine solidified, and social networks strengthened. I continued to monitor interactions with my children, maintaining careful boundaries and documenting communications. The house, while permanently lost, had become a symbol of resilience rather than defeat. Its absence reinforced lessons about autonomy, accountability, and the importance of nurturing personal strength alongside familial connections. Through all of this, I came to understand a profound truth. Betrayal, while painful, is not a permanent condition. Response, reflection, and resilience define the aftermath. By asserting boundaries, maintaining composure, and cultivating personal growth, I reclaimed authority over my life. Even in the face of profound disappointment, I realized that healing is not a linear process, but an ongoing journey requiring vigilance, patience, and self-respect. As the year progressed, I noticed subtle changes in my children's demeanor. Their engagement became more respectful, interactions more measured, and acknowledgement of past actions more consistent. While full reconciliation remained incomplete, the trajectory was positive. I had established a foundation for accountability, understanding, and cautious trust. The journey from betrayal to measured interaction had transformed not only my relationship with them, but also my own perception of strength, resilience, and dignity. And so, as I prepared for the next phase, continued engagement, personal growth, and cautious reconciliation, I understood that the journey was both challenging and empowering. Betrayal had tested every aspect of my being, yet it had also revealed capacities for resilience, clarity, and strategic thinking I had not fully recognized. I was no longer defined by the loss of the house or the actions of my children. I was defined by my response, my growth, and my ability to reclaim life with dignity and authority. Time had begun to soften the raw edges of betrayal, yet the memories remained sharp in my mind. Every morning I awoke with a quiet vigilance, a reminder that the loss of my house had altered my life permanently, but it did not define me. The space I occupied now was smaller, simpler, yet it was mine in every sense that mattered. Each object, each piece of furniture, each item carefully arranged reflected my deliberate choice to reclaim autonomy, comfort, and peace. I had learned to navigate life with intention rather than reaction, and this approach had become essential to my survival. I continued to structure my days with purpose. Mornings were devoted to reflection and journaling, afternoons to practical matters and personal projects, and evenings to quiet contemplation and social engagement. The rhythm of routine provided stability, a framework within which I could process lingering emotions without being overwhelmed by them. Writing letters to my children, even though I did not intend to send them, remained a daily exercise, a means of clarifying thoughts, affirming boundaries, and giving voice to feelings that had been suppressed during the immediate aftermath of betrayal. Interactions with my children were increasingly deliberate. Calls were answered with composure, texts with careful thought. I refused to allow guilt, manipulation, or emotional pressure to dictate my responses. Each engagement was an opportunity to reinforce boundaries, assert accountability, and model the behavior I expected. Slowly, I noticed subtle shifts, hesitations in tone, careful phrasing, and recognition of my authority. While full remorse had not yet been expressed, there was a growing awareness that their choices had consequences beyond immediate gain. I also expanded my focus beyond family interactions. Volunteering became an important outlet, providing a sense of purpose and connection to the wider community. Painting and creative projects offered emotional release, a means to channel feelings constructively. Reading provided perspective and insight, both into human behavior and strategies for navigating complex interpersonal dynamics. These activities were not mere distractions, they were integral to rebuilding my identity, confidence, and resilience. One afternoon, my daughter called unexpectedly. Her voice was tentative, careful. "Mom, can we talk? I think I need to understand things better about what happened and about us." I agreed, recognizing that this was a significant step. The conversation that followed was lengthy, emotionally charged, yet conducted with deliberate calm. I outlined the facts of the betrayal, my observations, and the steps I had taken to protect myself. I listened carefully to her perspective, noting attempts at justification but also moments of acknowledgement. The conversation was not about winning or punishing, it was about establishing clarity, accountability, and the foundation for cautious reconciliation. In the days that followed, I noticed a change in her behavior. Calls became more measured, respectful, and intentional. There was still a long way to go, but the trajectory was positive. I understood that healing and reconciliation are gradual processes, requiring patience, vigilance, and consistent reinforcement of boundaries. Each interaction reinforced the principle that respect and accountability are earned, not assumed, and that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt deliberately and cautiously. Meanwhile, I continued to strengthen my independence. I attended community events, engaged in physical exercise, and nurtured relationships that had been neglected during the upheaval surrounding the house and hospitalization. These connections provided emotional reinforcement, perspective, and support. They reminded me that life extends beyond the confines of betrayal, that resilience and personal growth are always possible, and that autonomy can coexist with selective trust and meaningful relationships. Unexpectedly, my son reached out in a more deliberate and cautious manner. He inquired about my health, my activities, and even my emotional well-being. I responded with politeness and composure, providing information without revealing vulnerability. I sensed that he was testing boundaries, seeking to gauge whether I had softened or remained vigilant. I did not waver. My response, measured and steady, reinforced the power dynamic I had worked to establish. I was no longer the passive parent. I was a prepared, aware adult capable of navigating complex emotional terrain. Weeks turned into months, and the shifts in both children became more evident. Their casual confidence in managing aspects of my life had diminished. There was cautious recognition of my authority, a tentative respect for my boundaries, and a growing acknowledgement of the consequences of their actions. While full reconciliation had not yet occurred, the foundation had been laid. Each measured interaction, each demonstration of patience and clarity, contributed to an evolving dynamic where respect was earned and trust was carefully reintroduced. Through all of this, I continued to reflect on my own growth. The betrayal had been devastating, yet it had revealed capacities for resilience, strategic thinking, and emotional mastery that I had not fully recognized. I understood that personal empowerment is not about revenge or domination, but about clarity, self-respect, and the ability to navigate complex relationships with composure and intentionality. Each challenge, each interaction, each moment of reflection reinforced these principles. One evening, I walked past the site of my former house. The new owners were there, tending the garden, maintaining the structure with care. A pang of sadness struck me, yet it was tempered by a sense of closure. The house, once a symbol of betrayal, was now a testament to continuity and respect. While I had lost the physical space, I had not lost the lessons, memories, or resilience cultivated within those walls. Their care was a reminder that respect and dignity can endure, even after profound disruption. I continued to maintain meticulous records of all interactions with my children, documenting communications, visits, and exchanges. This practice was not driven by suspicion, but by preparedness. I had learned that accountability requires clarity and evidence. By keeping detailed records, I ensured that future interactions would be guided by facts and principles rather than emotional reaction or manipulation. This diligence reinforced my autonomy and provided peace of mind. As the year progressed, I observed a subtle but meaningful evolution in my children. Their attempts to assert control diminished, their engagement became more thoughtful, and their acknowledgement of past mistakes became more consistent. While full reconciliation remained a distant goal, the trajectory was positive. I had established a framework for accountability, respect, and cautious trust, principles that would guide all future interactions. Simultaneously, I deepened my engagement with personal projects and social activities. Gardening, creative pursuits, volunteer work, and reading became anchors that reinforced identity, purpose, and emotional stability. Each day was a deliberate act of reclamation, asserting control over my environment, my routines, and my emotional responses. I realized that resilience is cultivated not only through confrontation, but through daily, intentional acts of self-care, reflection, and empowerment. One quiet evening, I sat by the window, reflecting on the cumulative journey. Betrayal had tested every aspect of my being, yet it had also revealed capacities for endurance, clarity, and strategic thinking. I understood that while material loss could wound deeply, personal strength, moral authority, and emotional resilience were impervious to theft. The lessons of the past months were profound. Boundaries must be respected, trust must be earned, and personal empowerment is the most effective response to violation. As I prepared mentally and emotionally for continued engagement with my children, I felt a sense of calm determination. The betrayal, though painful, had become a catalyst for growth, reflection, and strategic mastery. I was no longer defined by the loss of the house or the actions of my children. I was defined by my response, my strength, and my capacity to reclaim life with dignity, clarity, and resilience. The months had passed, and with them, the immediate sting of betrayal had dulled into a steady, quiet strength. Life had become measured, intentional, and resilient. I had rebuilt routines, regained my health, and reclaimed my autonomy. My children were no longer the overpowering forces I had once feared. They had begun to acknowledge, consciously or unconsciously, that the decisions they had made carried consequences that could not be ignored. And yet, even with the changes, I knew that the final chapter required confrontation not just with them, but with myself, an understanding that closure is not given, it is claimed. It was a crisp morning when I received the call from my son. The hesitation in his voice was unmistakable. "Mom, we need to talk," he said. His words were halting, cautious, laden with a weight that had been absent in our earlier interactions. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I allowed the silence to stretch, giving both of us the space to acknowledge the gravity of the conversation. When I finally spoke, my tone was calm, even, but infused with quiet authority. "Yes," I said, "let's meet and speak honestly." The meeting was arranged at a small, neutral cafe, chosen deliberately to avoid emotional triggers associated with past spaces. As I walked in, I observed them both. My son, hesitant and tentative, my daughter, anxious yet restrained. There was a palpable tension, a recognition that this conversation would be different from any before. This was not about confrontation in anger, but confrontation in truth. I began carefully, recounting the events as they had unfolded, the hospital stay, my vulnerability, the sale of the house without consultation, and the shock and betrayal I had endured. I did not speak in accusations, but in measured statements supported by facts and documentation. I emphasized not just the material loss, but the emotional and moral consequences of their actions. My tone remained calm, deliberate, carrying the weight of years of experience and reflection. They responded cautiously. My son attempted to explain his perspective, citing financial pressures and practicality, but his voice faltered when he noticed my unwavering composure. My daughter added her reasoning, acknowledging moments where she might have acted differently if she had fully understood the consequences. I listened without interruption, noting where their words were genuine acknowledgement and where they were rationalization. My role was not to punish, but to clarify, to establish the principle that accountability is inescapable and that actions have repercussions beyond immediate gain. As the conversation unfolded, I noticed subtle shifts. They grew quieter, less defensive. Their eyes occasionally met mine with a glimmer of recognition, an understanding that the consequences of betrayal extend beyond mere property. I highlighted this repeatedly, pointing out that trust, once broken, cannot simply be restored through words alone. It requires consistent actions, respect, and recognition of wrongdoing. Their posture, tone, and expressions gradually reflected comprehension. I then spoke of boundaries, not as restrictions, but as necessary structures to protect both myself and our relationship moving forward. I explained that reconciliation would not be immediate, nor unconditional. Respect, honesty, and accountability would be prerequisites for any deeper engagement. I watched as they absorbed this, the weight of reality settling in. For years they had assumed that love would erase consequences, that family ties could excuse breaches of trust. That assumption was now challenged, and I sensed that the realization was both uncomfortable and transformative. Hours passed as we spoke, sometimes in tense silence, sometimes in fragile dialogue. I emphasized that while the house had been lost, the relationship was not irreparable. Yet, repair required effort, consistency, and genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. It was a hard lesson, but one they were beginning to understand. The conversation, though exhausting, was a culmination of months of preparation, reflection, and measured strategy. For the first time, I felt that the foundation for cautious reconciliation had been truly laid. After the meeting, I walked home slowly, reflecting on the journey. The path from betrayal to acknowledgement had been long and painful, yet it had revealed capacities within me that I had never fully recognized. I had endured vulnerability, navigated deception, asserted authority, and reclaimed autonomy, all without losing my sense of self or moral clarity. The house, though gone, had served as a catalyst for transformation. Its absence forced me to examine not just the actions of others, but my own resilience, boundaries, and principles. In the weeks that followed, interactions with my children became more structured and measured. Calls and visits occurred within agreed-upon parameters, and while full reconciliation was still a work in progress, respect and acknowledgement were increasingly evident. They began to consult me on decisions that impacted shared interests, a subtle but meaningful recognition of my authority and experience. I noticed small gestures of consideration, a call before a visit, a request for advice, a willingness to listen without interruption, that indicated progress. During this period, I focused on consolidating personal growth. I deepened my engagement with hobbies, volunteer work, and social connections. Gardening became more than a pastime. It was a symbol of nurturing life, growth, and patience. Creative projects allowed me to channel emotion into constructive outcomes. Volunteering offered purpose beyond family, reinforcing the understanding that life's value is not solely tied to relationships with children or material possessions. Each activity reinforced resilience, autonomy, and self-respect. I also continued to reflect on lessons learned. Betrayal, I realized, is a test of character, both for the betrayer and the betrayed. It forces introspection, demands strategic thinking, and reveals capacities for endurance and emotional mastery. I had learned to navigate relationships with caution and wisdom, to assert boundaries without hostility, and to maintain dignity in the face of adversity. These lessons became guiding principles for all future interactions, both familial and social. Over time, I observed a subtle but meaningful transformation in my children. Their attempts to control or manipulate diminished. their engagement became more thoughtful, deliberate, and respectful. While full reconciliation had not yet been achieved, the trajectory was clear. Accountability and acknowledgement were becoming part of their behavior. I recognized that trust, though not fully restored, could gradually be rebuilt through consistent action, transparency, and respect for boundaries. One quiet evening, I sat in my apartment, reflecting on the journey from the hospital bed to this point. I thought of the days of pain, fear, and helplessness, and how each step of preparation, reflection, and measured action had reshaped not only my relationship with my children, but also my understanding of myself. I realized that empowerment does not come from avoiding vulnerability, but from confronting it, enduring it, and emerging stronger and wiser. I also understood that closure is not a moment but a process. It is claimed through deliberate action, clarity of thought, and unwavering adherence to principles. The house, once a symbol of betrayal, had become a symbol of resilience, strategy, and personal growth. Its absence no longer represented loss, but a challenge that I had met and overcome. Months later, a family gathering was held, a small tentative reunion. The air was cautious, yet there was warmth, respect, and the beginnings of understanding. My children, though still imperfect, demonstrated a willingness to engage with accountability. I observed them closely, noting their efforts, acknowledging progress, and maintaining boundaries. The dynamic had shifted, respect had been earned, authority recognized, and the potential for cautious reconciliation established. In the end, I realized that the journey was not about revenge or reclaiming property. It was about reclaiming self-respect, dignity, and agency. The betrayal had been profound, yet it had revealed capacities within me for strategic thought, emotional resilience, and moral clarity. I had navigated vulnerability, confrontation, and reconciliation without losing my sense of self. I had endured, reflected, and emerged stronger. As I looked out at the city skyline one evening, I understood the ultimate truth: betrayal may wound, but it cannot diminish the strength of a person who chooses to confront, reflect, and reclaim life with clarity, dignity, and determination. I was no longer defined by loss, deception, or betrayal. I was defined by resilience, growth, and the unwavering commitment to live on my own terms, with integrity, courage, and hope for the future. The house was gone, but I had gained something far more valuable: mastery over my own life, understanding of human complexity, and the power to engage with those I loved on terms that honored both respect and truth. And in that realization, I found a profound and lasting peace.